Kiddos, let's take a look at our rounding pages for this week. We are rounding decimals and we are using our skills for rounding, but we're also using our understanding of decimal place values. So be careful as you're going through these that you are not only following the steps, but you are also looking carefully at what it is being asked of you because we are bouncing around between please round to the hundredths, please round to the tenths. You have to make sure that you're rounding to the correct place value. So make sure that you're underlining the place value that you're rounding to. Circle the digit to the right and add a 0. If it's empty, this is very, very important when we're working with decimals. Use a circled number to decide if you should round up or roll back. And as always, change every digit after the underline to 0 for your final answer. So let's get started. Look and make sure you know what you're being asked to round to, whether that means you're circling it, you're underlining it, or you are just reading very, very carefully as you get into your directions, okay? First one, round to the hundredths place. That means I need to underline the hundredths place, circle the number behind. So this 8 tells me to round up, but remember, when I round up a 9, it becomes a 10. This has a ripple effect. So when I round this up, it becomes 500 thousandths, okay? Round to the nearest tenth. 7 tells me to round up. 7/10ths or 70 hundredths, both would be considered correct. Round to the nearest hundred. That 3 tells me to roll back. 450 thousandths. You could also say 45 hundredths. Both of these would be correct. Round to the nearest hundred. The 6 tells me to round up. I can say 250 thousandths, or I can say 25 hundredths. Both would be correct. Round to the nearest tenth. That 1 tells me to roll back. I could say 10 hundredths, or I can say 1/10. Round to the nearest tenth. The 6 rounds up to a 7. Everything behind becomes a 0, 70 hundredths, or 7/10. So both would be correct. That is the end of our first page. If you have any questions, please bring them with you to class. Looking at page number 2 of our rounding decimals, again, most important part is making sure that I know what I'm being asked to round. So whether you're reading carefully, underlining, circling something to get your attention, rounding to the nearest tenth, which is the 9. The 3 tells me what to do. The 3 tells me to roll back. 9 stays the same. Everything else becomes a 0. Either of these would be correct. Rounding to the nearest hundredth, that 5 tells me to round up. 320 thousandths or 32 hundredths, both would be correct. Rounding to the nearest hundredth, which is the 8. The 5 tells me to round up, so that 8 becomes a 9. Both of these would be correct. Rounding to the nearest hundredth, underline the hundredths, circle the thousandths place. That 5 tells me to round up. My 6 becomes a 7. Both of these would be correct. Rounding to the nearest tenth. The 2 tells me to roll back. This becomes 40 hundredths or 4/10ths. Rounding to the nearest tenth. This one has a ripple effect. Be careful. That 6 tells me to round that 9 up. The 9 becomes a 10, which also has to cross over into whole numbers. This rounds to whole number 1. You could say it's 1 and 0/10ths. 1 and 0 hundredths. Any of these would be correct, but watch this one. This one has a major ripple effect. Any questions? As always, please bring them to class. If you are ready for page 3, here we go, making sure that I know what they're asking me to do. Underlining my values, starting with the hundredth. If I'm rounding to the nearest hundredth, that means I'm rounding that 4 that 7 tells me what to do. My 4 rounds to a 5. Both of these would be correct. Rounding to the nearest hundred means the 4 is what I'm rounding. The 7 tells me what to do. I'm going to round up to a 5. Both of these would be correct. Rounding to the nearest tenth, that means the 2 is being rounded. The 9 makes my choice. So 30 hundredths or 3/10ths. Rounding to the nearest hundredth, that means that 8 is going to become a 9. Rounding to the nearest tenth, rounding the 7, the 2 tells me what to do. Round down or roll back. Rounding to the nearest tenth, rounding the 5, the 3 tells me what to do. 50 hundredths or 5/10. Any questions? As always, please bring them with you to class. On to page number 4. Make sure you know what they are asking you to do. Rounding to the nearest hundredth, rounding the 5, the 6 is the boss, rounding up. Rounding to the nearest hundredth, rounding the 4, the 3 is the boss, rolling back. Make sure you get the 0 in there. Remember, 0 is our hero. Even though it's nothing, it is super important. Rounding to the nearest tenth, roll back. Both of these would be correct. Rounding to the nearest tenth, again, roll back. Rounding to the nearest hundredth. It's 0. We don't have to change anything on this one, right? Because the 0 tells me to roll back, which makes it the same. We don't have to do anything to that. We can drop the 0. We don't have to. It stays the same. That one was tricky. The 8 tells me to round up. There we go. That is the end of page 4. Any questions? Bring them with you to class. Here comes our final page. As always, make sure you know what you need to do. Rounding to the nearest hundredth, the 9 tells me to round up. Rounding to the nearest hundredth, the 9 tells me to round up. It doesn't matter that it is a 0. It still gets rounded. 0 rounded up becomes a 1. Rounding to the nearest tenth, 6 tells me to round up. Rounding to the nearest tenth, the 8 tells me to round up. Remember, both of these options are correct because just when we drop the 0 doesn't change the value. Rounding to the nearest tenth, again, a 0. That 6 tells me to round up. Rounding to the nearest hundredth, that 7 tells me to round up. Any questions? Bring them with you to class, my little loves. Have a fantastic weekend.